The wind moved differently across Amarillo in the autumn of 1953, sliding low over the flatlands in long, whispering currents that carried the dust of harvested fields and the distant scent of mesquite. It was the kind of evening that arrived quietly, settling into the bones of the town like a slow breath, dimming the last streaks of daylight until the horizon dissolved into amber shadows. And on that evening, as porch lights flickered on one by one across the modest neighborhoods east of the railroad tracks, a small presence moved through the Campbell home. 3-year-old Liam, soft-footed and warm-eyed, absorbed in the simple rhythm of childhood without, yet sensing that the world was about to tilt irrevocably. He was a gentle child, the kind who drifted naturally toward calm rather than noise. In a decade marked by dust storms that still haunted, memories and the careful optimism of post-war families rebuilding their footing, Liam seemed to embody everything the town hoped the future might still hold: quiet trust, wide-open innocence, and a softness that disarmed even the roughest voices around him. He spent most afternoons toddling between the small backyard and the kitchen, where the hum of the refrigerator mingled with the faint hiss of gas burners from a stove that never truly cooled. Amarillo was a working town. Nothing stood still for long. Yet somehow, in the Campbell home, time seemed slower, anchored by routine. That house, perched on a corner lot with chipped white paint and a front walk that sagged slightly to one side, was surrounded by fields that had not yet surrendered their late-year dryness. Cars passed only occasionally, their engines rumbling low as families returned from shift work at the meatpacking plants or the rail yards. Floodlights buzzed on at the school down the street. Dogs barked. Radios crackled with music drifting between country twang and the sharper edges of early rock and roll. Beneath it all was the hum of a small, steady community that believed it understood itself, but just past the glow of those warm windows, beyond the trimmed hedges and thin curtains, the darkness seemed unusually dense, thick enough to swallow sound. As the sun pulled away, the air turned colder than expected for early fall, the kind of chill that makes the night feel more sentient, as if it were watching, listening, preparing. In that cold, a detail waited unnoticed, buried inside the ordinary, setting the stage for one of the most haunting disappearances Amarillo would ever whisper about. Liam played beneath the kitchen table that evening, surrounded by the familiar landscape of his small world: worn linoleum patterned in fading swirls, wooden chair legs smoothed from years of touch, a single toy car with the paint scraped from its roof. He traced the table's underside with curious fingers, humming tunelessly, drawn into a kind of private universe where the world felt safe. The storm door rattled in its frame. A gust tapped the windowpane like a quiet knuckle. Something shifted in the yard, subtle, indistinct, just enough to stir the air but not enough for an adult to notice. Yet atmospheric. Tension has a way of pressing itself into the environment before anyone understands its meaning. Amarillo lived by its routines, but on certain nights, routines failed to protect. A neighbor recalled years later that the street felt unusually still, as though the usual chorus of late-night birds and distant freight engines had been muted. The town lights seemed dimmer. Every house settled more heavily onto its foundation. And somewhere in that silence, an unseen thread was tugged taut, one that would eventually unravel a decades-long mystery and leave behind a void that no piece of the community could ever fully. The Campbells were an ordinary family, the kind photographers captured for local yearbooks or church bulletins, where smiles looked easy and futures seemed predictable. Their days moved with the rhythm of shift work, Sunday errands, laundry lines, and slow dinners. Nothing about them hinted at the weight of tragedy that was already drifting toward their door. But stories like this rarely signal their arrival. Instead, they seep in through the smallest cracks, quiet enough to be missed until it's far too late. That evening, the sky deepened into a dark velvet blue, the kind that swallowed the last streaks of daylight until the horizon became a soft smudge. Street lamps flickered awake in uneven intervals. Crickets fell quiet. In the Campbell backyard, a single swing hung unmoving, the rope worn thin where small hands had gripped it again and again. The grass rustled, though no wind seemed to pass through it. A presence lingered on the edges of the property, patient, indistinct. Measuring the rhythm of the house, Liam moved from the table to the back window, pressing his fingertips lightly against the cool glass. The yard stretched small and familiar before him, framed by the pale glow of the porch light that cast long shadows across the fence line. There was nothing remarkable about the night, no storms, no visitors, no disruptions, yet something in the air seemed to fold inward, as if holding its breath. The stillness felt intentional, almost deliberate. If someone had been watching closely, they might have sensed the shift, might have noticed how the ordinary had begun to warp under the weight of what was coming. But hindsight is a cruel teacher in stories like this. Even decades later, investigators would return to these early moments, combing through them as though memory itself held the missing piece. They would reconstruct timelines, measure distances, interview aging neighbors, and sift through fragments of recall softened by time. They would trace footprints through old soil samples, examine forgotten photographs, and pore over handwritten logs from officers long retired. And in every re-examination, one truth lingered. The clues had begun gathering long before anyone realized they were clues at all. Some memories from the neighborhood would shift subtly over the years. An unfamiliar truck seen briefly, a stray dog barking toward the fence line, a porch light flickering out at an odd moment. None of these details stood out in 1953, but they would later form the scattered constellation of a case that refused to settle into silence. Even in this first moment, the story was already branching, splitting into what was seen, what was missed, and what would come to define the mystery for generations. Because in the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found, patient, buried, and determined to surface. Even if it took half a lifetime. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? The next morning dawned pale and cool, the sun rising slowly over the flat Texas horizon, as if reluctant to disturb the stillness lingering from the night before. The Campbell home, small, square, and familiar to everyone on the block, filled with the early sounds of routine. The clatter of pans in the kitchen, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the radio warming up with a faint static before settling into a morning broadcast. It was a kind of domestic rhythm that anchored families across Amarillo in 1953, each day beginning with predictable movements that felt safe, even comforting. Within this cadence, 3-year-old Liam moved with a gentle purpose unique to toddlers curious. Steady, unhurried, he wandered through the hallway with a kind of careful wonder, dragging his fingers along the textured wallpaper that had been there long before he was born. It was patterned in tiny, repetitive shapes that caught the dim light just enough to create shifting shadows along the seam lines. He often paused to examine those shadows, tilting his head slightly, fascinated by the way morning light changed everything it touched. Those small moments, those quiet pauses, were the essence of who he was: soft-spoken, observant, drawn to stillness rather than noise. In the kitchen, warm air drifted toward him, carrying the scent of frying bacon and the faint sweetness of biscuits rising in the oven. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Cabinets thumped lightly as breakfast took shape. Liam moved toward the smell, drawn by familiarity and the easy warmth of family routine. His small feet padded along the cool linoleum, each step echoing softly in the modest space. Outside, the neighborhood was waking slowly, screen doors creaking open, dogs barking lazily, a lawnmower sputtering to life somewhere down the block. Amarillo in the early 50s was a place defined by such sounds, predictable, grounded, almost meditative in its simplicity. Yet beneath that simplicity, subtle shifts were beginning to take hold. Neighbors would later recall that the birds seemed quieter that morning, their usual chatter replaced by an unusual hush. Others mentioned the air felt thick, as though holding on to the remnants of something unsettled from the night before. Such recollections would grow in significance only with time. Long after the events of that day faded from immediate understanding, Liam spent most of the morning immersed in the small rituals that defined his world. He stacked wooden blocks into towers that leaned precariously, but delighted him nonetheless. He wandered to the front door, watching through the screen as a milk truck rumbled past, its glass bottles clinking softly in their crates. He shuffled back to the living room, where patches of sunlight stretched across the carpet in soft, golden pools. He sat within one of those patches, watching dust motes float lazily in the quiet air. These simple observations, these small wonders, were the landscape of his life. In the backyard, the swing from the night before creaked gently as a breeze finally stirred the stillness. The grass, still touched by the cool air, shimmered faintly under the rising sun. Wooden fence panels cast long, narrow shadows across the dirt. It was a yard built on decades of small-town resilience, gardens planted, weeds pulled, toys lost and found again. And yet something about it carried an unease that would not be recognized until much later. The swing's subtle movement, the faint indentation near the fence line, the quiet. The Campbells lived in a part of Amarillo where neighbors knew one another by name, and where the routines of one home blended seamlessly with the next. On that particular morning, a few neighbors waved from their yards as they watered plants or hung laundry on the line. They saw nothing remarkable, just an ordinary family beginning an ordinary day. It was the last time anything would feel truly ordinary. Liam's gentle nature made him a favorite in the neighborhood. He often toddled along the sidewalk under careful supervision, pausing to examine leaves, ants, and the occasional chalk drawing left behind by older children. His attention was always anchored in the smallest details, tiny discoveries that drew him into quiet fascination. Those who knew him often remarked on how easily he smiled, how naturally he leaned into moments of calm, as though the world made more sense to him when it moved slowly. As the morning edged into late hours, sunlight sharpened across the yard. The radio played softly from the kitchen, carrying news of harvest conditions, local happenings, and the shifting winds expected later in the evening. Liam wandered toward the back door several times, drawn repeatedly to the outdoors. The dryness of the fields, the scent of earth thick in the air, the faint hum of distant traffic, all of these created a world he felt at home in. No. One realized then how closely those ordinary moments would later be examined. Investigators would spend decades sifting through accounts from that morning, attempting to piece together a timeline that had dissolved into fragments. They would consider how long Liam played in the yard, who might have passed by the house, what shadows lingered near the fence line, and which noises had blended into the hum of daily routine unnoticed. Yet even in those early hours, the clues were already forming, weaving themselves silently into the day, because somewhere beyond the quiet edges of that yard, beyond the fence line and the trimmed hedges, something waited, something that had moved in the night, measuring the rhythms of the household, waiting for the moment when routine would leave a small, unintentional gap. That gap was approaching faster than anyone understood. The afternoon would hold its own secrets, shifts so subtle they would be missed in real time but become central to the investigation that followed. The pattern of sunlight through the back window, a faint scuff in the dirt, a moment when no one was looking, all of it forming a silent progression toward the event that would fracture the town's sense of safety for decades. But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. The afternoon light settled over Amarillo with a muted glow, filtering through a thin haze that softened the edges of the small houses and quiet streets. It was the kind of light that made shadows stretch long and deliberate, tracing gentle lines across yards, alleyways, and fences. In the Campbell home, that glow drifted through the back windows, warming the linoleum and settling across the modest furniture like a soft blanket. It was a peaceful hour one that should have passed without consequence. Liam drifted in and out of play, his movements slow, almost meditative. He lingered near the back door again, pressing his small hand against the glass pane as though studying something beyond it. The yard was calm, the air still holding the coolness left over from the morning. A row of brittle, sun-bleached grass swayed in a light breeze that seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. The faint rustle barely registered against the backdrop of distant trains and muted neighborhood chatter. He stepped into the yard with the kind of quiet confidence that children display when entering familiar spaces. The swing, lightly stirring in the mild wind, caught his attention first. He padded across the dusty grass, leaving tiny footprints that investigators would later try to distinguish from countless others. He reached out and touched the rope, feeling its coarse texture beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the simplicity of touch and movement. His world was made up of these details, textures, warmth, sunlight, the subtle vibrations of the swing returning slowly to stillness. Behind him, the Campbell house sat warm and ordinary, its chipped paint catching the afternoon light, its screen door rattling faintly whenever a gust pushed through the yard. Inside, the day's rhythm continued uninterrupted, laundry rotating through its cycle, kitchen dishes drying on the rack, the faint hum of the radio shifting between country harmonies and brief news updates. Nothing felt rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of steady, unremarkable calm that families depend on. And yet, within that calm, the shadows near the edges of the yard seemed to deepen, creating pockets of unmoving darkness that didn't quite match the rest of the landscape. A few fence planks leaned at odd angles, worn by years of weathering, their slanted shapes catching the light in a way that made the gaps between them appear wider than before. A lone bird perched on the far fence rail, unusually still, watching the yard with a curious intensity. These were details that would matter later, but in the moment, they blended into the familiar backdrop of a quiet day. Liam crouched near a patch of dirt beside the fence, fascinated by a trail of ants moving methodically along the edge of a worn board. He leaned closer, studying their movements as though decoding a pattern only he understood. His small fingers brushed lightly over the ground, gathering dust that clung to his skin. He hummed softly to himself, absorbed fully in the moment. To him, the world was gentle, navigable, predictable, but just beyond the fence line, where the shadows converged into a quiet stillness, the air seemed to thicken. The stillness was not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that arrives when something unseen is waiting. Neighbors later remembered a strange silence settling over the block at that exact time, as though the usual rustle of wind and distant traffic had been pulled away. Even the bird on the fence remained motionless, its feathers stiffened by an instinctive caution that no one noticed. Inside the house, the sound of a closing cabinet, the faint clink of silverware, the steady rhythm of daily tasks all continued without pause. Routine offered a sense of protection, a belief that familiar patterns could shield a family from anything unexpected. But in stories like this, routine often masks the moment right before everything changes. At some point in the early afternoon, the back door creaked open and shut again. A detail so ordinary it would later be lost among countless overlapping recollections. Some neighbors recalled seeing a small figure near the fence line. Others believed they heard a brief scuffle, though they could never be certain whether the sound had been real or imagined after decades of retelling. Most remembered nothing out of the ordinary at all. What investigators would later agree on was simple. Sometime during the quiet span of that afternoon, Liam drifted toward the far end of the yard, drawn perhaps by the shifting shadows or a glimmer of movement, or the curiosity that guided so many of his small explorations. The gaps in the fence, barely noticeable to adults, were more than wide enough for a child to peer through or slip through entirely. Beyond those gaps lay a narrow alleyway lined with gravel and patches of stubborn grass. That alley would become a central focus in the investigation. Tire tracks, footprints, an overturned box, a single scrap of fabric tangled in a shrub. None of it could ever be definitively tied to the moment Liam vanished. But each detail added weight to the growing unease that settled over the community as the hours unfolded. As the sun shifted toward late afternoon, the light in the yard changed again, sharp and angled. Shadows stretched farther. The bird finally flew off, leaving the fence rail empty. The wind quieted, and in that thinning silence, a faint echo, barely perceptible, passed through the alley. A metallic clang, a rustle, something shifting just out of view. Then, without warning, the subtle presence that had lingered near the fence line all day seemed to contract into a single point of stillness. A moment that would fracture the timeline permanently. A moment that, despite every effort to reconstruct it, would remain hidden in the folds of uncertainty and partial recollection forever. By the time the household resumed its usual late afternoon rhythm, the yard had grown still. The swing no longer moved. The indented patch of dirt near the fence showed only faint impressions, and the narrow gap in the boards seemed slightly wider than it had that morning. Inside, someone called out for him, expecting to hear small footsteps, to see the familiar toddle into the room, to find him tucked beneath a table or perched beside a window. But the house stayed quiet. Liam was no longer there. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found, but finding it would take decades. The first minutes after a disappearance are never recognized for what they are. They pass quietly, disguised as ordinary moments, an extra minute spent finishing a chore, a pause before checking a room, a small assumption that the child is still nearby. In the Campbell home, those minutes slipped by unnoticed as the late afternoon light deepened and the house settled into its familiar rhythm. But when the quiet stretched too long, when the expected sound of small footsteps failed to return, the air inside the home shifted. A subtle tension crept in, the kind that comes before a realization fully forms. When they finally stepped into the yard, the world outside looked deceptively undisturbed. The grass swayed with the same gentle movement as before. The swing hung still, and the fence line cast long shadows that reached toward the house like dark, slender arms. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet the soft indentation near the far end of the fence, the slight widening of the gap between the boards, and the faint trail of disturbed dirt formed the quiet outline of something gone terribly wrong. The call for Liam's name carried into the air, swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the open neighborhood. The first sweep of the yard was quick, driven by instinct rather than fear, a belief that he must be hiding just out of sight. But the second sweep lingered longer. The third lasted even longer still. And with each passing moment, the calm veneer of the afternoon cracked, replaced by a rising urgency that spread rapidly through the house. And out onto the porch, neighbors reacted first with curiosity, then with concern. People stepped out of their homes, towels slung over shoulders, rakes still in hand, laundry half hung. This was a community where families kept close track of one another, where children wandered freely but were never truly out of view. A missing 3-year-old was not something that fit within the accepted boundaries of their world. Voices called out. Screen doors slammed. Feet pressed quickly across gravel and dirt. The alley behind the Campbell home became the first focal point. It stretched long and narrow between back fences, its gravel uneven, its edges marked by discarded wood scraps and patches of stubborn weeds. A few neighbors walked its length, eyes scanning for any sign, a small footprint, a toy, an article of clothing. They found none. Yet the unsettled feeling only grew stronger. Something about the silence of the alley, the stillness that seemed to cling to its shadows, suggested that whatever had happened had occurred quickly, silently, and with unsettling precision. Within half an hour, word spread farther down the block. The local grocer's wife left her register to join the search. A teenager on a bicycle rode the stretch of the street repeatedly, scanning sidewalks and driveways. A man working on his truck paused mid-repair, wiping his hands on a rag before hurrying toward the Campbell home. The community moved with an urgency born not from fear of the worst, but from disbelief that anything beyond the ordinary could have happened here. But as the sun dipped toward the horizon, the search grew more frantic. People fanned out in wider arcs toward the open fields, toward the drainage ditch near the far end of the street, toward the neighboring yards and alleys. Each new area brought no answers, only a deeper sense that the timeline had slipped out of their grasp. By early evening, Amarillo police arrived. Officers in pressed uniforms stepped carefully through the yard, their eyes trained on the small details that others had overlooked. They examined the fence line first, noting the gap between the boards, measuring its width with practiced hands. They studied the ground beneath it, where faint impressions, too soft to offer certainty, hinted at recent movement. A pair of officers traced the alley with slow, deliberate steps, marking areas to photograph before the daylight faded entirely. In 1953, the investigative methods were methodical but limited. Polaroids were uncommon in Amarillo, so photographs required cumbersome equipment and deliberate positioning. Fingerprint dusting was imprecise outdoors. Footprint casting depended heavily on the condition of the soil, and the dry ground behind the Campbell home offered little to work with. Still, officers recorded everything they could. Measurements, notes, sketches, each detail captured carefully, though none of it provided the clarity they urgently needed. As night settled over the neighborhood, the once familiar landscape transformed. Streetlights flickered on, casting pale amber halos across the quiet streets. Porch lights glowed weakly, illuminating faces lined with worry. The fields beyond the houses, usually calm and silent, now felt ominous, their darkness seeming to stretch endlessly outward. Officers organized search teams equipped with flashlights and lanterns. Their beams cut through the night in thin, trembling lines as they combed through every corner of the neighborhood beneath porches. Inside unlocked sheds, along ditches, behind hedges, through vacant lots. Dogs were brought in from a nearby farm, trained but limited. They circled the yard, noses to the ground, picking up faint traces of scent that seemed to lead toward the alley before dissipating entirely a short distance beyond it. The handlers repeated the process multiple times, but the results remained the same. The trail faded quickly, as though erased by the very air. The officers' radios crackled with updates, none of them promising. No sightings, no sounds, no meaningful clues. The community, though determined, began to feel the weight of something far more sinister than a child wandering out of sight. Rumors spread quietly among the searchers, whispered in low tones as they passed one another in the dark. A stranger seen earlier in the day. A car that didn't belong on the street. A truck that had idled too long near the school. None of these reports could be confirmed, but each one fueled a growing unease that the disappearance had not been accidental. By midnight, the search expanded outward, encompassing the edges of town where dirt roads stretched into long, empty landscapes. Officers drove slowly along those roads, scanning the ground with high beams, stopping whenever the dust seemed disturbed in unusual patterns. They checked drainage culverts, abandoned sheds, and isolated barns. They spoke to night shift workers at the rail yard, asking whether anyone had seen a small child near the tracks or wandering along the service paths. No one had, The Campbells sat within their home, surrounded by neighbors who refused to leave. The house felt suspended in a strange, breathless tension, lights on but offering no comfort, furniture familiar but now foreign under the weight of the unknown. Every sound outside, the crunch of footsteps, a murmur of conversation, the thud of car doors felt magnified, as though the entire world had narrowed to the search for one small boy. But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. The investigation settled into its first full day with the gravity of a storm that had already passed but left damage in its wake. By sunrise, Amarillo had become a town suspended between disbelief and dread. The Campbell home was now a command center of sorts, officers taking careful notes, neighbors hovering anxiously, and the family moving through the haze of fear with practiced politeness, trying to maintain appearances while their hearts raced. Every surface in the house seemed to carry the echo of Liam's absence, the stillness of the empty chair, the untouched toys scattered across the floor, the soft hum of the radio that now sounded like a ghostly accompaniment to their panicked. Officers retraced the child's steps in meticulous detail, reconstructing the day from fragments of observation and the slow, faltering memories of those who had been nearby. Witnesses came forward, their recollections uneven but tinged with urgency. A man walking his dog recalled seeing a small figure near the fence line around midday. A neighbor remembered hearing the faint scrape of wood against the ground. Each recollection, however incomplete, was catalogued and weighed. Detectives sketched diagrams of the yard, the alley, and the fence, noting distances and angles as though these measurements could anchor the timeline that was unraveling in real time. The search expanded further into the surrounding blocks, past the familiar streets and into stretches of dry, empty fields where tall grass whispered under the morning wind. Officers moved with a slow deliberateness, scanning the horizon for anything unusual. A faint tire track here, a scuff of dirt there, each became a potential clue, magnified in importance by the uncertainty of the situation. The texture of the landscape itself, the uneven soil, the low hills, the scattered brush was documented thoroughly, as every detail could later be cross-referenced against witness statements or potential paths of escape. By mid-morning, detectives had begun compiling lists of persons of interest, though at that stage no one truly stood out. Amarillo was not a town accustomed to crime of this nature. The idea that someone could abduct a child from a familiar yard was almost inconceivable. Yet the impossibility only fueled the determination of the officers and volunteers alike. They fanned out in organized lines, sweeping the perimeter of the neighborhood, checking under porches and behind fences, carrying lanterns and flashlights despite the brightness of the day. Every shadow became suspect, every noise a potential lead. In the Campbell home, the atmosphere shifted from confusion to focused fear. Parents moved quietly, answering questions, providing descriptions, and recounting the day's events repeatedly, each iteration sharpening the officers' understanding of the timeline. Officers examined every room, noting the absence of struggle, the lack of forced entry, and the mundane perfection of the environment. These details created a puzzle that was both simple and impossible. No signs of coercion, yet a child had vanished. No disturbance of the home, yet the world outside had become a place of hidden threat. Community response was immediate and immersive. Neighborhood children were gathered inside homes, parents walking blocks to ask questions, and volunteers spreading outward toward the open plains that fringed the city. Local radio stations broadcast alerts and requested assistance, creating a wider network of eyes and ears. Word of the disappearance traveled to nearby towns, drawing relatives and friends who offered manpower and perspective. Though few could truly grasp the fear gripping the Campbell family. By late afternoon, officers had begun the painstaking work of collecting physical evidence. A few tiny footprints in the dirt near the fence had been identified, but quickly faded under the shifting wind and dry soil. Officers documented them, measured them, and photographed them with whatever equipment was available in 1953, but the fragile traces offered only hints. A scrap of cloth caught on a shrub raised eyebrows, but it remained uncertain whether it was related. Every potential lid was treated with care. The hope of discovery intertwined with the frustration of uncertainty. The procedural work extended to interviews with everyone who had been in the vicinity, including those who had only seen fleeting glimpses of movement. Each statement, while imperfect, contributed to the mosaic of possibility that investigators were piecing together. They noted contradictions, minor inconsistencies, and improbable timings, but without corroboration, nothing could yet be acted upon. The absence of certainty weighed heavily, magnified by the relentless passage of hours. As night fell again, the search took on a new intensity. Officers and volunteers returned to the open fields with lanterns, flashlights cutting through the shadows. Dogs, trained for tracking, were brought in for another sweep, noses pressed low, bodies tense. Their search suggested a faint trail leading briefly toward a neighboring block before dissolving entirely. The officers recorded these observations meticulously, yet no tangible conclusion could be drawn. The vanishing seemed complete. Inside the Campbell home, the family clung to small, ordinary markers of life. The radio broadcast a soft mix of music and news, offering a fragile sense of continuity. Meals went uneaten, toys remained untouched, and chairs at the small table were left empty. Even routine objects seemed to mourn the absence of the child, whose laughter once filled the spaces now occupied by silence. The house itself seemed to absorb the unease, every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of wind through the windows reinforcing the reality of what had occurred. Investigators had begun to suspect that this disappearance was neither random nor accidental. The faint anomalies, the footprints, the displaced dirt, the scrap of cloth hinted at deliberate action. Yet the lack of direct evidence made accusations impossible. All that remained were fragments, suspicions, and the overwhelming weight of uncertainty pressing down on a community ill-prepared for tragedy. The small town that had once felt impermeable now seemed fragile, exposed, and uncertain. But even amid this uncertainty, the first threads of a longer investigation began to take shape. Reports were filed meticulously, sketches were created, and photographs carefully labeled. The case was cataloged, prioritized, and archived. Officers left the neighborhood in shifts, but the search never truly ceased. The missing child remained central to every conversation, every cautious step, every sleepless night in Amarillo. The clock ticked on, but no answers emerged. Decades later, investigators would look back at these earliest hours and see both precision and limitation, a methodical, patient work constrained by the tools and knowledge of its time. What seemed invisible then would later acquire significance. What was dismissed as coincidence would emerge as pattern, and what was lost in the rush of urgency would become the foundation for the long, painstaking pursuit of truth. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. Weeks passed, and Amarillo settled into an uneasy rhythm. The search for Liam had stretched beyond the initial urgency, transforming the community's anxiety into a dull ache. The Campbell family moved through days haunted by absence, meals taken in silence, toys left untouched, rooms meticulously maintained yet impossibly hollow. Every small sound, distant dog bark, the swing's faint creak in the wind, the scrape of a gate hinge carried potential significance, a reminder that he had been here and then vanished without a trace. Investigators returned repeatedly, combing through evidence, revisiting witnesses, and re-examining even the faintest anomalies recorded in the early hours. But the case had already begun to cool. slipping into the quiet corridors of cold cases and unresolved mysteries. Detectives focused on the little details that might have been overlooked initially. The scrap of fabric found near the fence, while too insubstantial to draw immediate conclusions, was preserved carefully. Footprints and soil impressions were photographed and measured, catalogued alongside every interview, every sketch, every recollection. Investigators worked with what they had, knowing that even decades-old evidence could speak if treated patiently. And yet, each day brought frustration. The frustrating absence of anything concrete, anything definitive. The neighborhood itself was quiet, but not untouched. Families moved with a subtle wariness, windows left half shut, children guided more closely along sidewalks. The streets, once familiar and safe, now carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Even small, ordinary activities were weighed against the backdrop of disappearance. A passing stranger, a car that lingered too long, a package left at the wrong doorstep. The community had begun to see the unseen threads that sometimes tied ordinary life to unseen danger. In the days that followed, investigators turned to personal connections, attempting to reconstruct every interaction in Liam's short life. Teachers, neighbors, relatives, all were questioned, not for wrongdoing, but to form a complete picture of routine and exposure. Liam's gentle nature, the quiet attentiveness that defined him, became central to understanding both his movements and the potential vulnerabilities in his world. He had been unafraid, trusting of adults and his surroundings, often following the natural curiosity of a toddler more than any adult guidance. It was a quality that made his disappearance all the more devastating. Some leads were fleeting. A neighbor recalled seeing a man standing near the alley several days prior. The memory faltered under repeated questioning. An old truck was noted as idling near the street, but no records could confirm its driver or purpose. Investigators preserved everything, even what seemed tangential, aware that time often revealed patterns invisible in the immediate aftermath. Every fragment, every overlooked shadow or minor anomaly could one day become the hinge upon which the case turned. Forensic limitations of the era constrained the immediate breakthrough. DNA analysis was decades away. Fingerprint techniques were rudimentary, reliant on dust and ink, difficult to apply to outdoor surfaces like gravel or dry soil. Investigators relied heavily on witness testimony, sketches, and the meticulous documentation of environmental clues. Still, the smallest trace, the turn of a fence board, the scuff of dirt, the tiny scrap of fabric was preserved, carried forward in hope that future science might illuminate the mystery. Amarillo itself had become part of the case. Streets and homes previously mundane were now mapped in detail. Distances measured, sightlines recorded. Officers retraced Liam's last known path repeatedly, establishing the boundaries of the search. The town's layout, once taken for granted, became both a map of possibility and a record of absence. Each alley, yard, and fence line was examined under the scrutiny of trained eyes and the relentless focus of community concern. And then, in the quiet months that followed, something unexpected began to emerge, not in the present, but in memory. Witnesses revisited moments with fresh clarity, recalling details once thought insignificant. A neighbor remembered a fleeting glance of movement near the fence at a precise time. A child recalled Liam standing by the back window, watching a shadow along the alley. These recollections, isolated at first, began to form faint connections, threads stretching across the fabric of memory toward a broader pattern. Investigators cataloged these fragments with care. Even the smallest inconsistencies were recorded. The exact timing of household routines, the placement of toys, the alignment of shadows in the yard. Each note became part of the larger mosaic, preserved for future review. They understood that time could both obscure and reveal, that human memory, though imperfect, might yet illuminate what physical evidence could not. Years later, one particular breakthrough would emerge from this patient, meticulous work. A single detail, a corner of fabric preserved from the fence, its fibers analyzed with modern techniques, would open a door long thought sealed. Evidence that once seemed insignificant would suddenly carry weight. Patterns hidden in memory, dismissed as coincidence, would gain meaning. And yet, in the midst of this slow revelation, the human cost remained tangible. A family enduring the emptiness of absence. A community shadowed by what could not be explained. A small child frozen in time by a moment none could recover. The quiet investigation, the careful preservation of evidence, and the patient reconstruction of memory exemplified the tension between human limitation and the relentless pursuit of truth. In those years, Amarillo itself became a witness, holding on to its small-town normalcy while silently recording the fractures of one household's world. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Decades passed, and the threads of Liam's disappearance began to weave into something more tangible. Something that would not be fully understood until long after the neighborhood streets had grown quiet and familiar again. Investigators, some now retired, revisited the case with fresh eyes, sifting through faded reports, yellowed photographs, and meticulously cataloged evidence that had been preserved for generations. Every minor detail, the scrap of fabric caught on the fence, the soil impressions near the alley, the witness's fragmented memories, was analyzed against new techniques, new science, and the evolving understanding of criminal patterns. What had once seemed trivial began to take on a life of its own, revealing subtle signals that had been invisible in 1953. Technological advancements finally allowed for a level of scrutiny unimaginable at the time of the disappearance. Microscopic fibers could be compared with a precision that exceeded early visual analysis. Soil samples could be tested for chemical traces. Even decades-old environmental conditions were reconstructed using historical weather reports, soil density records, and vegetation studies. Each piece was meticulously re-examined, cataloged, and cross-referenced. What emerged was a slow, deliberate uncovering of a timeline that had long been obscured by incomplete observation and the limitations of memory. Witnesses, now elderly, were interviewed once more. Their recollections, often inconsistent, were compared and layered to find patterns that had been invisible during the original investigation. One neighbor remembered seeing a shadow near the alley at a precise time. Another recalled hearing a faint metallic noise in the distance, the faint scrape of movement across dirt that no adult had paid attention to in 1953. Taken together, these small threads began to outline a pattern, a sequence of movements that suggested a deliberate presence, someone who had observed, waited, and acted without immediate detection. The tension in these reconstructions was palpable. Each small clue brought a mixture of hope and dread. Investigators also revisited archival records from the town. Police logs, neighborhood reports, and personal diaries offered subtle hints of anomalies in routine. An unfamiliar vehicle parked near the block for hours. Passing strangers who had been curious but unnoticed. Small disruptions that had seemed inconsequential at the time. These were cross-checked against the preserved evidence. Footprints, the slight displacement of soil near the fence, the pattern of sunlight and shadows in the yard on that afternoon. Slowly, a framework emerged, allowing investigators to chart potential trajectories, places Liam may have been taken, and the timing of key events with unprecedented accuracy. Forensic breakthroughs, particularly in fiber analysis, provided the most promising leads. The scrap of fabric discovered near the fence, once thought insignificant, was analyzed using modern techniques that allowed fibers to be traced back to specific materials and origins. Investigators discovered that the material matched textiles consistent with a type of garment commonly used in local households at the time. narrowing the possibilities to a limited number of sources. Though not immediately conclusive, this evidence allowed the case to move from theory to focused investigation, giving new direction to a decades-long pursuit of truth. The reconstruction of that day also revealed subtler environmental cues. Shadows from the fence and nearby structures indicated the sun's precise angle, confirming timelines derived from witness statements. Dust and soil patterns, combined with historical weather records, revealed the trajectory of a potential path through the yard and alley. Each detail, painstakingly reconstructed, added layers of certainty to what had once been speculative. The investigation shifted from searching for a missing child to reconstructing an event frozen in time, an event whose details had been quietly preserved in the textures of the neighborhood itself. The psychological landscape of the case became apparent as well. Liam's trusting, gentle nature, his inclination to follow curiosity over caution, framed the understanding of how he could have been led or drawn away without resistance. This realization did not lessen the horror of the disappearance, but clarified the mechanics of it, the patience required, the subtle observation of routine, the understanding of how a small child interacts with a familiar environment. The investigation became as much a study of human behavior as of physical evidence. Amarillo, too, bore witness over the decades. Residents who had remained in the neighborhood recounted quiet unease, unexplained noises, subtle changes in routine, the occasional shadow that seemed out of place. These recollections, once dismissed as coincidence or imagination, were revisited with serious attention. Every memory became a potential piece of the puzzle, contributing to the slow assembly of a picture that spanned generations. And yet, despite the advances, the case retained its haunting quality. The gaps in time, the partial recollections, and the fragmentary physical evidence created a persistent tension. The certainty that something had been lost, that a truth existed somewhere beyond reach, but also the recognition that the passage of decades had made the task exponentially harder. Investigators moved with a mixture of caution and urgency, understanding that every detail could matter, but also that the trail could have been altered or obscured beyond recovery. The patient pursuit of this truth, combining both human memory and scientific methodology, slowly illuminated the shadowed corners of Liam's disappearance. The outlines of that day in 1953, once hazy, confused, and fragmentary, began to solidify into a coherent narrative. Every clue, preserved and re-examined, brought them closer to understanding what had happened, inch by inch, detail by detail, shadow by shadow. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The breakthrough came quietly, without fanfare, in a nondescript laboratory tucked within a larger municipal building. Decades-old evidence, preserved meticulously in labeled boxes and sealed envelopes, was finally subjected to a level of scrutiny that the 1953 investigators could only have imagined. A single scrap of fabric, once dismissed as incidental, was analyzed using advanced fiber microscopy and chemical testing. The results were subtle yet revelatory. Fibers that matched not only a specific textile, but a production batch, traceable to a handful of households in Amarillo at the time. Investigators immediately cross-referenced this with neighborhood records, family inventories, and local stores. A web of connections began to emerge, faint but undeniable, drawing a line from the ordinary domestic world to the previously invisible hand that had disrupted it. In parallel, soil residues collected from footprints near the alleyway were re-examined using modern forensic techniques. The granular composition, previously indecipherable, revealed traces of materials consistent with a nearby construction site, long abandoned by the early 50s. Combined with the witness recollections revisited in Section 7, these findings allowed investigators to reconstruct with unprecedented specificity the path of that day, the yard, the fence, the alley, and the first stages of movement beyond the Campbell property. Every small detail now resonated with significance, no longer invisible to the patient gaze of methodical science. But it was not only physical evidence that propelled the investigation forward. New interviews with surviving neighbors, conducted with sensitivity and patience, uncovered observations that have been buried under layers of time and forgetfulness. One elderly resident recalled a fleeting figure near the alley, describing posture and movements that aligned with the reconstructed sequence. Another remembered a vehicle parked unusually long near the intersection, a detail that initially seemed trivial but now correlated with fiber evidence and witness trajectories. Slowly, a pattern of calculated opportunity and observation emerged, one that had been invisible to the casual eye yet unmistakable when all fragments were aligned in the quiet corners of the Campbell household. Memories of Liam's innocence and curiosity were reanimated through these findings. His gentle nature, his tendency to follow light, shadow, and movement without fear, painted a portrait that helped investigators understand both his choices and his vulnerability. He had been drawn naturally into the rhythm of that afternoon, trusting in his familiar surroundings, even as forces outside his perception quietly converged. The tragedy, once a chaotic gap in time, began to take on a structured, horrifying logic. Community reactions mirrored the slow unfolding of revelation. Families who had lived in Amarillo during the 1950s were drawn into recollection, combing old photographs, diaries, and scrapbooks for additional fragments. Every overlooked corner of the neighborhood became a potential source of insight. The town itself, steeped in the memory of the event, seemed to participate in the reconstruction, a living archive of small-town interactions and faint impressions that survived in both material evidence and human memory. Decades later, investigators identified subtle errors in the original search perimeter. Areas previously deemed unremarkable were now re-examined under a lens informed by both advanced analysis and pattern recognition. Shadowed corners, neglected fences, and overlooked alleys were cataloged anew. Each detail, when integrated with fiber and soil analysis, built a map that allowed for the first time a coherent visual reconstruction of the abduction route, beginning with the yard, extending through the fence, and moving outward toward a constrained set of potential locations. But the emotional weight of discovery was immense. The Campbells' absence of closure, stretched over decades, now faced a grim confrontation with specificity. The pieces that science provided were cold, precise, and unyielding. They did not offer the warmth of return or the comfort of explanation. They offered a framework, a map, a sequence. The town, too, felt this collision of knowledge and loss, where confirmation of the past brought clarity and grief. Simultaneously, forensic breakthroughs opened new avenues for investigative outreach. Comparisons with similar cases in Texas and neighboring states revealed patterns. Abductions carefully planned, exploiting small, trusting children in familiar environments, often leaving almost no immediate trace. This broader perspective contextualized the event within a larger, chilling narrative, connecting the isolated tragedy of Amarillo to methods that had repeated elsewhere, undetected for decades. Investigators realized that the case, while deeply personal to a small town, was also part of a wider network of criminal opportunity and exploitation. Yet, despite these revelations, some aspects remained enigmatic. No perpetrator had been conclusively identified, and the precise motives beyond the act itself remained speculative. The investigation now balanced on a knife's edge between understanding and uncertainty. Each finding illuminated part of the truth, but also deepened the questions. Who had observed the family so closely, and why had the abduction remained invisible in plain sight? How had a child so universally cherished been drawn into such a calculated sequence? In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. And now, decades later, That truth had begun to speak, slowly, inexorably, from the shadows of memory and the remnants of evidence that time had preserved. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a patience forged over decades. Investigators, armed with a reconstruction of the path from the Campbell yard through the alley, began to narrow the list of possible individuals who could have acted on that day. Fingerprints taken from the fence in 1953, long thought unusable, were reanalyzed using modern enhancement techniques. While they could not produce a complete match, partial prints combined with witness descriptions and fiber analysis created a profile narrow, precise, and chilling in its clarity. Patterns emerged that suggested deliberate observation, timing, and knowledge of a child's habits. This was no random opportunity. Someone had watched, studied, and moved with methodical patience. Community interviews reinforced the emerging narrative. Elderly neighbors remembered a man who had lingered near the block for days, someone whose presence had initially seemed ordinary, curious, polite, harmless. Minor anomalies they once dismissed became crucial: an unusual pause on a street corner, an odd vehicle parked at odd hours, a glance toward the Campbell yard that now seemed calculating. The repetition of these small behaviors across multiple recollections strengthened the case, providing texture to the forensic framework. Each memory, though distant, became a brushstroke in the emerging portrait of that day. Investigators, then, returned to the open fields and neglected corners of Amarillo, where decades of change had transformed the landscape but not erased the imprint of past movements. Soil sampling, vegetation patterns, and historical maps allowed them to reconstruct possible locations where Liam could have been taken, hidden, or moved. Each site was examined carefully, with a combination of modern technology and the patient observation methods of old-school detectives. The layers of time, both physical and psychological, were painstakingly peeled back, revealing a path of deliberate choice, a choreography invisible to anyone who had witnessed only fragments of that afternoon. The emotional impact of these discoveries was profound. For the Campbell family, the slow reconstruction provided clarity, yet it also reanimated the loss they had carried silently for decades. Every new fact, every confirmed trajectory, became both a revelation and a wound. They had lived in the shadow of uncertainty for so long that the precision of the past now pressed heavily against the present. The truth offered understanding but not solace, mapping the contours of grief with the cold lines of forensic certainty. In parallel, law enforcement coordinated with regional and national agencies, cross-referencing the profile with unsolved cases in Texas and neighboring states from the same era. Similar patterns emerged: children taken from familiar yards or streets, with minimal trace, often involving careful observation and patient timing. While these links could not yet identify a specific perpetrator, they contextualized the Amarillo case within a broader, darker landscape, illuminating the systematic nature of such acts. This perspective offered investigators a clearer understanding of methodology and motive, if not yet resolution. The final breakthrough came through a combination of persistence and serendipity. A surviving relative of a household identified as the likely source of the fiber evidence was located, and careful interviews unearthed corroborating recollections. The presence of a particular individual at precise times near the Campbell property, seemingly mundane activities that, in hindsight, revealed deliberate observation. The convergence of forensic, environmental, and testimonial evidence formed an unmistakable chain. The sequence of events, once a disjointed blur of absence, now unfolded with terrible clarity. As the pieces aligned, the town of Amarillo felt a strange reckoning. Streets once familiar now bore the weight of remembered shadows. Neighbors revisited long-forgotten interactions, replaying ordinary days that had carried extraordinary significance. The collective memory of the community, interlaced with tangible evidence, created a portrait both meticulous and haunting. The persistence of detail, the patient reconstruction of time, and the careful layering of observation had finally illuminated a path through the decades-long uncertainty. Yet even in the revelation, tension lingered. While investigators had reconstructed the sequence with precision, the human element, the motivations, the choices, the inner workings of the individual responsible remained obscured. The case now existed as a dual narrative, one of forensic clarity and one of profound human mystery. The sequence of actions could be traced, but the heart behind them could not. This duality magnified the psychological weight, leaving the community to reconcile understanding with the enduring impossibility of full comprehension. In the quiet corners of Amarillo, where shadows of the past had long lingered, a narrative had been pieced together. The lost child's final movements, once hidden in silence and uncertainty, had been revealed through patient, methodical work. The town, the investigators, and the family were left to navigate the complex aftermath. The relief of knowledge tempered by grief, the closure of pattern balanced against the absence of the child's return, the satisfaction of discovery shadowed by lingering questions. Decades later, one detail finally broke the silence. The combination of careful forensic analysis, preserved evidence, and long-remembered observations had illuminated the sequence of events. The truth, long obscured by time, patience, and circumstance, had emerged. And in that revelation, the world, though changed and incomplete, acknowledged what had been lost and what had endured in memory. By the time the full reconstruction of Liam Campbell's disappearance was complete, Amarillo had changed almost beyond recognition. Streets were wider, houses repainted or replaced, and children now played in yards that had once carried the weight of absence and fear. Yet in the quiet corners of the town, echoes of 1953 remained subtle reminders that life, even in small towns, carries both continuity and fracture, the ordinary coexisting uneasily with the extraordinary. The resolution of the case did not erase the decades of uncertainty, but it illuminated them, transforming the void of unanswered questions into a carefully mapped narrative of what had occurred. The Campbell family, older now and marked by time and grief, faced a quiet reckoning. The knowledge of how the day had unfolded, reconstructed with painstaking precision, brought clarity and horror in equal measure. They traced the steps of the abduction through diagrams, photographs, and reports, seeing their child's movements, their own routines, and the invisible hand that had manipulated them in horrifying proximity. For years, the absence had been a shadow. Now, it was defined, sequenced, and undeniable. The emotional weight was immense. Relief existed only in understanding, not in recovery. Liam was gone, but at least his path, brief, fragile, and tragically curtailed, was known. Investigators reflected on the extraordinary patience required to unravel the case. Decades of meticulous documentation, cross-referencing of witness memory, preservation of fragile evidence, and eventual application of advanced forensic methods had turned near impossibility into clarity. The case became emblematic of the slow, cumulative power of methodical investigation proof that time, though often an adversary, can also be a tool. What was invisible to hurried eyes in 1953 became unmistakable to the patient scrutiny of generations. The town of Amarillo, too, felt the lingering effects of revelation. Streets and yards that had once been familiar were now tinted by the knowledge of what had occurred in the ordinary spaces of their everyday lives. The case became part of collective memory, discussed quietly in homes, schools, and among neighbors who had once walked past the Campbell yard without noticing the subtle disturbances in time and space that now seemed so consequential. The psychological imprint of the event, compounded by the painstaking reconstruction, left a subtle but persistent mark on the community's perception of safety and trust. Yet there was dignity in the unveiling of the truth. Liam's life, though tragically brief, was remembered through the meticulous care of investigators and the patient assembly of evidence. The details of his curiosity, his gentle nature, and his tender attentiveness to the world around him were preserved in narrative alongside the forensic findings. In every photograph, every diagram, and every recollection, Liam remained present, recognized as a human being. A small child whose world had been quietly extraordinary before the abrupt intrusion of tragedy. His life was not erased by absence. It was memorialized through the rigor of truth. The resolution also underscored the limits of human understanding. While the sequence of events, the path of the abduction, and the environmental and forensic context could now be traced with clarity, the motivations and inner workings of the perpetrator remained largely unknowable. The case, in its final form, was a testament to both the power and the humility of investigation. It revealed what could be discovered, preserved, and interpreted, while simultaneously acknowledging that some aspects of human behavior remain inscrutable. Even after decades of patient study, in the quiet aftermath, the town and family began to navigate the delicate space between grief and comprehension. Knowledge offered a kind of peace, if not closure, the understanding that the tragedy had been deliberate, observable, and reconstructible, but also that Liam's absence had shaped generations of experience, leaving marks on a community, on a family, and on the collective memory of small-town America. Amarillo continued, streets bustling, children playing, routines unfolding, but beneath the surface, the memory of that day remained indelible, refracted through every shadow, every alley, and every corner once familiar and now preserved in recollection. Decades later, the story of Liam Campbell stood as a quiet testament to the persistence of memory, the meticulous dedication of investigators, and the fragile humanity of small-town life intersecting with forces beyond comprehension. His curiosity, his gentle attentiveness, and the ordinary details of his brief existence remained at the heart of the narrative, intertwined with the extraordinary work required to illuminate the truth. And in the culmination of patient investigation, in the mapping of absence into understanding, a sense of recognition, if not reconciliation, was finally achieved. In the quiet corners of Amarillo, a truth had been found, and though it could never restore what was lost, it allowed the town and the family to acknowledge what had occurred: a child's life remembered, a disappearance traced, and a story told with precision, dignity, and reverence for the life at its center.